Hi, and welcome to the Red Tunic Podcast, a podcast where I look to rediscover what makes gaming fun and enjoyable by having positive conversations with those related to the industry. My name is Link, and today I'm joined by Anton Hand, VR developer at Rust Limited, creative lead on hotdogs, horseshoes, and hand grenades. Hi, Anton. How are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Well, that's great to hear. And no, thank you so much for making time to talk with me. It's always a pleasure, and as always, I'm really appreciative of your time. So, Anton, before we get started, would you mind maybe telling me and your listeners a little bit about yourself for those that might not know exactly who you are?
Sure. Well, I'm an independent game designer and developer working at Rust Limited, which is a company that I started with my three best friends in the world. We originally had we met back at the University of Buffalo back when we were all a combination, a sort of a mixture of students and teachers, and originally started making art together and doing contract work together, and then becoming a game studio. So we are very much a group of an extended family, and we get to work on a game together, which is what more could one ask for.
And that's great to hear, being able to work with, as you put it, your best friends and continue to work with your best friends. And yeah, getting to do something that you all enjoy, that's pretty fantastic as well, especially with your game, hot dogs, horseshoes, and hand grenades. And I apologize in the future if I say it wrong. I'll probably just say 3H to make it simple.
It actually goes by H3 for short, so you can just
H3,
say that.
sorry about that.
No worries.
That is what I'll do. But yeah, it's pretty fantastic that, you were all able to come together through different means, as you said, students, teachers, what have you, to make the game. And, I have had the experience of, or the joy, I should say, of getting to play your game. I personally don't have a VR headset, but one of my friends does. And when I convinced him or bribed him really with pizza to let me come over and play VR games for an afternoon or what have you, your game was one of the first ones I insisted on trying because the idea of it was absolutely fantastic, and I say that in the sense of just the the um, the mix of real life physics or what have you for interacting with weaponry and such, but then the how do I say the nonsense of shooting hot dogs and whatnot, right? Um, it was I had a blast playing it. Is really what I'm trying to get to. So I'm glad that you guys were able to make something that I hope you all realize how much fun people have with.
Always glad to hear it. And it's very much it's a piece that is an expression of all of our unique senses of humor and our sort of relationship to the absurd. So,
And that's I can always appreciate uh, absurd humor. It's in my life, at least, kind of how I get by with things, in that I spend most of my time uh, being amused by absurdity, only because the alternative would be um, a complete downward spiral into, you know, horror and terror as it all unwinds. So I can very much appreciate the absurdity. Um, I do have a question though.
of course.
And this is based on, seeing what you guys have been working on um, for the game moving forward and such. But why hot dogs?
So the name of the game originally just before there were even hot dogs envisioned as being actually in the game as characters, sort of stemmed from, just the way that we tend to ideate as a group tends to come oftentimes originates in wordplay and playing around with ideas. And so as we had been doing those first sets of experiments in VR, which was very oriented on throwing things, like a hand grenade was one of the first things in my testing scene that I had gotten operational in the early days before the project even had a name. We had there's that idiom involving close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. And we thought that could be theoretically like a fun center of a title. And so we were thinking about like what would make alliterative sense to be paired with horseshoes and hand grenades. And so we were just thinking about the theme space of the game is like, of horseshoes as being the sort of like quintessential summer lawn game, and the fact that the game was going to be very much centered around firearms, sort of playing around with Americana, and was thinking like grilling, like that's what goes with horseshoes, grilling out, eating hot dogs. And it's just that was the original sort of thematic glue that came together. And as the game sort of evolved from being just a pure sandbox into a slightly more structured game that had other entities and agents in it, hot dogs and meat in general became really sort of a thematic focus. And this was born out of Adam, our group's sort of like and the game's sort of lead writer and the person who's really most concerned with the sort of broad spectrum meaning present in the project. It sort of pushed forward this important theme that the game's sort of satirical relationship to war and combat and things would be about the the sort of way in which the structures of war, and like that the player and these entities are just sort of interchangeable meat. You are just meat. You're literally referred to as meat in some of the more sort of narrative modes of the game. And so that's how the hot dogginess of the game sort of bloomed, we'll say.
Wonderful. Yeah, there's just wonderful. Thank you so much because um, the the I'm almost speechless just because of how it what you said makes what makes narratively makes sense for what you're trying to do, broader spectrum and such as well. But it's just wonderful. Thank you. I find it absolutely amusing that that it came about because of the close enough and wanting to have the alliteration in the name or what have you. Just wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. So Anton, if you don't mind, can you maybe explain how you got into developing and making games? Now I know you did mention, or I've read, that you did uh, uh, modeling or what have you. So I don't know if that came first or if that came later, but yeah, by all means, please just jump right in there and cut me off and go.
Sure. So I was a digital artist first. I mean, I was an analog artist even before then, but I got my first sort of taste of doing digital art back when my father got our first computer in our household, which was actually something he got as part of doing a job. We were of small means, so a computer wouldn't have been something that ever expected to even have in the house. But a client of his who was looking out for him was like, John, here's a computer. These are the future. You got to start learning how to use one of these. And so I got access to one at about the age of 9. And I basically, I think the first piece of digital art I ever made was making custom icons for his desktop with an icon editor that came with the computer. And that very quickly sort of grew into an obsession for me. He would find downloaded off of where sites every art program available at the time, and was just like, "Hey, to try this, see if you like Kid Pix, Microsoft Fine Artist, things along that lines." But eventually, especially because of the cartoons that were on at the time, Reboot, Transformers, Beast Wars, and such, early 3D stuff was what absolutely captured my imagination. And so I started doing 3D art in a program called Caligari True Space around when I was 10. It was very rudimentary because I didn't have anyone to teach it to me. The tome-like manuals for these applications were much more like documentation for them, in that none of the material that came with these apps taught you any technique. It was much more like, this is what this button does as described by an engineer. And so when I look back at how much progress I was actually able to make in those early years, it wasn't much because I had no referent on how to actually make models and shapes and things like that. But I enjoyed it all the same. And that interest, I originally thought, throughout, like, say, high school, that I wanted to be a 3D animator. That was what I was really into, between movie CG, cinematics, and video games and such. And then when I got to college, the reality at that time of what being an animator was going to be like as a job really started to register. The sort of like, well, you're going to be keyframing the finger joints of one of the, like, M&M's characters for a 30-second M&M's ad sort of thing. Like, I lived on the wrong side of the country to ever, like, go work on a Blizzard cinematic, so that was never happening. And I sort of fell out of love with it as a result. And but thankfully around that time, there was actually a computer science instructor at the University of Buffalo who was like, what you actually, there's a different department here at the university that I think has something you'd be into. And it was a part of the digital media studies program at UB that had a low cost virtual reality system designed for artists to use that was run by Josephine Anstey and Dave Pape. And I got access to that, and that blew my mind to chunky bits. It was like absolutely life-changing experience. And it was like, we're not talking about like head-mounted display VR here. We're talking about like a rear projection, like single projection screen with two projectors behind it with polarized lenses. You'd put on glasses that made it so that each of your eyes only saw the light from one of those two projectors. But it had magnetic hand and head tracking similar to our sort of current Rev of VR. The graphics were very primitive compared to anything. Um, but it was absolutely life changing, and that was the moment that I knew what I wanted to do with my life was interactive media in some form. So really from there, it was much more, I didn't necessarily get right into making what you'd consider sort of a game developer, but I've sort of like, I dabbled across for about 10 years, different forms. I did VR architectural visualization. I was very into Second Life for years and had several Second Life businesses. Uh, yeah, it sounds ridiculous, but long before all of this, like, digital asset, this and that everyone was talking about, I supported myself from making shoes that don't exist in a in Second Life, and doing I did architectural work, I taught classes in SL. Is really my life until I went it was only through beginning to meeting the other Rusty guys and us beginning to do art games together, like artwork that used the gaming media as a form, that really pulled my focus towards games as such. um and we did that really as a creative practice together. I went to grad school, and it was post that experience and post coming out to California to all live in one place out here, um, that sort of like my life became about games. And with the sort of big first wave of HMD VR, we had an opportunity to actually put out a product. And then the past 6 years of working on that weird hot dog game has transpired, and that's how I find myself here.
So that is absolutely fantastic. Just the journey that you described. So thank you for sharing that. And I I well, not exactly the same. I think I and many others can probably relate to the realization when you're faced with what you think is your dream, or what something is very similar to your dream, and then it ends up being, as you said, keyframing the M&M's big chunky hot dog fingers as they, grab an M&M or whatever, and realizing that's really not what you want to do, or how, that will really quickly not be the thing that you can do for the rest of your life, you know?
Yep. Absolutely.
As well as that's fantastic. Not fantastic. It's amazing to hear that you were starting and exploring VR when VR was that thing that like you would see in the movies from like the early 90s or the late 90s or what have you, where they had it set up like, well, like you described with all of that stuff. And because I personally, while I was aware of that, I still typically hear VR and immediately just think of a HUD on your head or a whatever, a set of screens on your head with everything else. And I personally forget that it existed as it did, or as you were, as you had to learn about or use. So that's that's awesome that that's where you got to start and got to experiment and see it coming to fruition.
Yeah, and the thing is, we actually had an HMD as well, that was, like, heavy, bulky, and it was super narrow field of view, and I think each eye was something like 320 by 240 pixels or something like that. It was headache-inducing, and you very quickly got neck strain because your eyes had to it was basically like looking at the world through a pair of toilet paper rolls. And so at that time, like the HMD was a curiosity. It was cool and fun, but a cave setup, even a single screen cave setup, was so much more immersive. And especially because you could have other people there, even though the projection wasn't correct from their perspective, they could still see and participate in the experience of what was there.
And yeah, and I can definitely understand, being able to share that experience because for those that haven't had, the joy of actually trying VR, with the full from their perspective, as you put it, being able to see things normally or properly, being able to at least view it on a screen or what have you and see what they're trying to do or really wrong ways to try and phrase this, but being able to participate, as you said, is fantastic because you get an idea and you can see it and you can also just enjoy the sheer insanity of what the tech is allowing to happen.
Yeah.
So, Anton, with that in mind, based on your experience, starting with modeling and animating and all the way to where you are now, is there any experience that, or sorry, is there any advice you might be able to give to those looking to get into the industry?
I mean, it's difficult. Like, even when we say the industry, that's a pretty broad spectrum at this point. And so at the end of the day, I feel most comfortable talking specifically to the people who are coming from the direction of the sub-discipline that I have the most lifetime experience with, which is 3D art for games. And to those people, I would have to say that the advice that I give is that there are certain areas that the educational structures for that discipline tend to completely lack, that are really, really important to excelling and standing out relative to the many, many, many other people who are fighting for the exact same sort of job that you're interested in. And the sort those sorts of sub areas that I emphasize over and over again to people is one, becoming a software autodidact as fast as possible. Most of the programs that prepare 3D artists for the games industry are focused on a single tool chain, and you learn that tool chain in a context that's very easy to learn that a tool chain, which is like you have someone to ask questions and they probably have some books and YouTube videos. But the quicker that you can become the sort of person who can just looks at a new piece of software that you have to learn as a tiny speed bump, the more flexible and the more job secure you will be in the long run, because all of this software changes over time. You won't be using the same thing that you're using now 5 years from now, or it certainly won't be in the same combination. The sort of second category that I definitely put out there is that when you are actually working in, especially at a, say, a studio that doesn't have just cash coming out of every orifice, You will frequently be doing things quote unquote the wrong way because it's the most time effective way based upon goals and resources. So being able to work imperfectly is really important. Not just that whole sort of like 80%ing something, but learning how to 80%, 60%, 40%, and 20% things, and learning what things you can get away with doing good enough work that is done very, very rapidly, and then emphasizing the stuff that gets more attention. Um, and then the sort of third category is learning how to work on and with assets that you did not make yourself. If you talk to any indie 3D artist, especially who is like on a sort of small team, many of those projects nowadays manage to fill out their full content spectrum through licensed assets, whether that's something coming from an outsourcing studio, whether that's something coming off of a marketplace, or just something that was already in the project before you joined as an employee. Learning how to be able to take a quote unquote done asset and perform surgery on it to change it into, like, we're like, that needs to have 2 more buttons on it, or that needs to not be that color and shape, or we got a bunch of assets but they have all this trademarked and copyrighted text in all of their texture channels, and you need to remove all of those without messing up the surrounding texture information. All of those things are incredibly important to learn, and none of those things are taught at any school program I've seen. And those are the skills that are going to make you indispensable, because in a big way you become a fixer at that point. You become someone who isn't just doing work and producing assets. You become a person who can solve problems that other people have. So that's the core of my advice in terms of people who are looking to separate themselves from the rest of the crowd.
So thank you for sharing that. And you know, I am not in the same field. Now I am a programmer. I have experience as a designer, and much of what you're saying, I think I think many people can appreciate, even from not the strict same path that you took, but it all makes a lot of sense because one of the things that you said that really resonated with me was when I went to school for design. The main focus was, you have the brief, you have the spec, you go do it, and it's kind of a safe place to experiment. But at the same time, it's a controlled environment, and you're not going to learn how to do a lot of the kind of dirty work that you're going to have to do once you're really out in the field. Like you said, going in and taking taking text off of something because it's copyrighted, or it's not applicable, or it's not whatever, or working with someone else's files. None of that is covered, and I think that's a really good set of advice. Everything you said, I think all of that's a really good set of advice because it's things that you otherwise would learn after you're out the door, and you have to learn it at the same time and same speed as everyone else. And as you said, when you're trying to, or I'm paraphrasing, mind you, but as you said, when you're trying to like get ahead of the crowd and whatnot, you you want those techniques, you want those skills that let you be ahead of that crowd. And I just think that's wonderful advice, so thank you for sharing that.
My pleasure.
Now, Anton, you had mentioned that you got your first PC at 9. I don't know if you would have been playing games elsewhere before then, or if that would have also been when you first got to maybe play video games. But what was your favorite game as a child, and what made that game, your favorite?
So I got into, like, I'd played some NES games as a kid, but it was one of those, like, even though my parents sprung for an NES, I only ended up having like 3 or 4 games for it over the life of it because they're all so expensive back then. But for the PC, the thing that really grabbed me, that once again sort of dovetails with this early obsession with 3D, was the game Descent 2. Because like my just because of parents and content censoring, like, I didn't have Doom, I didn't have the really any sort of games that were gory, but spaceships and dark caverns were okay. And so Descent 2, which if you've never played it, for anyone listening who hasn't, you are basically in this space. You're a mercenary in this spaceship that has been sent into this series of like asteroid mines out in the solar system that essentially the mining robots they have lost control of and are attacking people. So you have to go into these mines, rescue some miners onto your ship, destroy all of the malfunctioning robots, and then blow up the reactor that's in the center of the mine and escape before it blows up. It's a 6 degrees of freedom game. So you'd have like we had a simple joystick that you played it with, sort of joystick plus keyboard, which was a bit much, honestly, for like a 10-year-old to play. It was very challenging for me, and I think that's one of the other things that really held my attention about it is that it asked a lot of you as a kid to play. But it was the sort of labyrinthine space. It was fundamentally a horror game. It's just a sci-fi horror game instead of a like spooky blood and ghosts horror game. And fantastic soundtrack. That if you look at who like one of the members of Skinny Puppy did a bunch of tracks for it, so the music was incredibly evocative because it wasn't like 8-bit music. It was full CD audio tracks that played while the game played. And so just the entire immersive audiovisual experience, it captured my imagination and I played it all the time. And a lot of the work, like the ship from Descent was one of the first complex things I ever tried to 3D model myself. And I still think to this day, a lot of the ways in which I think about space and what I find compelling in a virtual space are still informed by initial loves and initial, evocative things that struck me all the way back then.
So thank you for sharing that. And I too had some experience with Descent, not as much as you clearly. And I agree completely that the amount of controls and such for games like Descent or from that era, I think that was one of the weird um, weird pros of them, in that there was so much you could do and so much you had to do to play it appropriately, that it was charming in its own way. And it's great hearing you describe it as you did, because like I said, I didn't have much experience with it. I played maybe the demo and that would have been it. But you know I I've heard positive things from other people, and the way you painted it as well, it makes me kind of want to try and figure out a way to play it uh, nowadays. And I only say it that way because it's a relatively old game, and I have no idea how if there's an um, easy way to
All,
play it safely.
all of those games are still maintained with modern renderers by fan communities. It's really quite incredible, especially like the free space games that came out of them. Descent Free Space 2 in many ways is still like the bar when it comes to a dramatic presentation, linear storyline, 6DOF simulator sort of thing. And really, like, you know what, it's as I say that and was thinking about Descent 2, I think the other thing that's really that I don't think I realized until now was how much my early tastes were shaped by games that were combining the design and control ethos and complexity that came out of like milsim games. The sort of like deep, unforgiving, this is as complicated as doing something in real life games, combined with fiction. So instead of having them in like a military context, like you're in a spaceship in outer space sort of thing. So I think that combo of things, I mean, still really defines my creative interests to this day.
And that's fantastic to hear. And I can definitely understand what you're saying and how you would get there uh, after having played your game. Uh, when I did play it, when I did have the ability to try it, one of the first things that we did, we being my friend and I, was trying to manipulate the guns, trying to like actually load them, use them, everything. And he had only himself been able to figure out so many of them, and
Mhm.
it was a absolute joy to realize just how realistic it was, to the extent that I forget what gun it was, but I was playing around with it in the game, and my stepfather actually owns the same gun, and immediately when the first time I saw it, I was able to just do what I did in the game with it, which was, know what needed to get done, how to, load it, unload it, all of that fun stuff, which the movies, in my mind, make things far easier than they really are, you know?
Yep, and that's, I mean, one of the interest points from the very beginning of this project in terms of playing around with sort of firearm operational simulation was to like games like, despite the omnipresence of firearms in video games, they are deeply homogenized because we are interacting with them through such an abstracted, standardized interface. Like, the design needs of the standard first person shooter is that you've got 4 to 6 buttons, and those 4 to 6 buttons do the exact same thing no matter what power or object or weapon you have in front of you. Whereas, like, all of the interesting nuance that comes from, I mean, if you look at the average firearm, they're all doing roughly the same thing. They take a metal cartridge filled with a propellant that deflagrates and fires a piece of metal through the air, and they all just do it a different way, and with like all of the nuance between them, and in real life also, they mostly sound the same sort of thing, more than most video games ever represent. All of the nuance, all of the real interest beyond just aesthetic variation is in the operational details, and those are all paved flat by almost every video game that has firearms in them. And so that has always been one of my driving design and content interests in H3, is to celebrate all of the interesting differences in those things, and to be able to evaluate them next to each other and be like, wow, this is, who thought this was a great idea? I think so. Paul, one of the most enjoyable types of firearms to add to the game is one that's terrible, that just has a, like, who would put this switch here, or why does this operate this way, sort of thing, and getting to experience both good and bad ideas, and unreliable ones.
Yes, what you just said resonated really well, because some of the weapons that I did try when we were playing H3 was, I forget what one it is, but from a design point, when I was younger, like, oh yeah, this is an awesome gun, and then I read more about it, and universally everyone hates it because of just its function, and getting to try that in the game, to put it best, was I was sitting there trying to figure out how to use it, and what ended up happening was I just threw it at a hot dog and grabbed a pistol that worked. And it was, it was absolute mindless fun to just go, well, screw this gun. And you realize in that moment, it was more effective for me just to throw it at something than it was to try and use it. So I understand, like, the methodology or what have you behind the what you guys are doing with H3 is, I love it, because it's absolutely what I enjoy getting to do. And I'm glad to hear that from the get-go, or maybe not from the get-go, but that is a primary focus that you guys have.
Absolutely.
Now, I do want to talk about this. I do want to ask you this one, because you had indicated that you would like to discuss this question, as well as you kind of mentioned the military sim uh, games, or just the complex nature of them and games like that. So, is there a game that you enjoy, whether it's related to this lead-in or not? I apologize if it isn't. But is there a game that you enjoy that you feel just doesn't get enough credit?
Absolutely. I spent a good amount of last year ranting about it, which is a game called Escape from Tarkov. Which, Tarkov is interesting, just from the beginning, in that it doesn't really cleanly fit into a single genre. it is it is simultaneously like a milsim shooter, an MMO, a a sort of like, like looter shooter in certain ways, and a game that is entirely about sort of like eco play, you know. So for anyone who hasn't played it, in super short, the idea is that you are playing as a PMC soldier in basically like a Russian province that has sort of like basically become an anarchic war zone between this sort of like Western PMC corporation and and a native one, and there are sort of like independent scavengers that are also in the battle space. And you play it by equipping yourself with equipment that you have that you lose if you die in the actual game space. You get certain missions, and you go into one of a set of this like 6 or 7 levels. You end up spawning somewhere random in that space, and you've got a certain amount of time, somewhere between like 20 minutes and 45 minutes, to complete whatever your objectives are, and you can decide what those are. You can choose to do missions, you can choose to hunt other players, you can choose to hunt AI agents in the space. You can just lay in a bush and listen to the rain fall on you and listen to distant battles and learn about the flow of what transpires in the level over that period of time. And then you have to successfully get to an exit point, which is usually on the opposite side of the level than where you entered. If you don't leave the level manually before that time runs out, you also just die and lose all of the equipment on you. So it's this survival of it's like it's a PvPvE MMO that is deeply survival of the fittest, is has as much detail as any milsim shooter has involving its weapon operation, a deep body simulation. You take location based damage, you can bleed, there's multiple types of food and drink, there's bandages and sort of like splints, and it is as unforgiving as of a multiplayer game as I have ever played in my life. And as a result, it is the level of sort of like residence in the virtual space that you feel you have. Your embodiment is so specific and so deep and so broad, and the amount of information that you have to parse very, very rapidly in it to survive is pretty overwhelming. It's borderline impossible to learn how to play the game on your own. It is very much designed, if you can have someone to Sherpa you into the experience, that's going to be, you're much more likely to have a good time instead of just playing for 20 minutes at a time, dying, and being like, well, now what? Um, but I love it precisely because it defies standard genre classification, that like something like, I see it as being a conceptual cousin to something like Descent Free Space, in that what it is attempting to do is it's taking this very, very deep set of simulations and then is plugging them into a more fictional context that is a lot, that really allows you to experience the full expressivity range of those simulations and emergent situations that come out of those simulations colliding with each other.
So thank you for explaining Escape from Tarkov like that. I've I've been aware of the game. I've never played it. I've been interested enough to know the bare minimums of everything you said, and the way you put it, it has me far more interested in it than think I've ever been before. So, thank you for that, because the game, the way you described it, with the way you approach it, or the way I'm trying to think of the right words for that. The way that you see it and experience it, it sounds like a much more enjoyable game than I initially wrote it off as, based on like the surface level of what it is. So
And
thank you
and
for
I
that.
Of course. And I think really at the core, like if you're like, what's the single, like the simulation is all important. But I think the thing that's most interesting to me at the sort of top level, at the meta structure is this, like as I've gotten older, the things that interest me most in terms of game spaces are things are are ones that aren't prescriptive. The fact that everyone is entering into a Tarkov level with a very self-determined goal, all of which could be theoretically valid within the whole system's expression, and that you don't know what everyone else is trying to do in the first place, and you don't know whether your goals conflict with anyone else's at any given moment, is what creates such an interesting situation. That it's the simulation and the world first, and then you pour your intent into it. And I don't think there are many multiplayer games that are like that. That's a rare thing.
I absolutely agree that I don't think I've ever come across a multiplayer game that really sort of just goes, here's the tools, and in this case, the tools would be like what you drop into the level with, so to say, and the rest of it just being, yeah, get to the point, and anything between point A and point B or entry and exit is completely up to you. I don't think I've seen a game like that because in most cases, from my understanding, games of similar nature are usually centered around being the last one alive or being the group or what have you that gets the MacGuffin and gets to the extraction point with said MacGuffin and whatnot. And to know that's all that the game is, I think that's a really fantastic way to just kind of let you determine and define your own experiences based around just what you go in with, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
Yeah. And I think it's why its closest corollaries in that way are a very, very short list of MMOs that have really privileged individual players' ability to define the shape of their experience. And so that's things like EVE Online and really the original Ultima Online sort of thing. Like we have put, especially post World of Warcraft, we have turn so many of these multi-user games into pick which funnel you would like to walk down as being the breadth of experience of that you're allowed to define and steer your experience. And it's so nice to find something that is much more like an open plane.
Yeah, definitely. And until this moment, I actually forgot Ultima exists, which is absolutely horrible, seeing as that was such a genre-defining setup. Games like it are few and far between. Ultima, the Star Wars Galaxy, I believe it was. Um, well, not exactly the same, or at the end it might not be the exact same, but what have you. The few and far between of those is way too wide, given that those can be some really wild games with some really great core gameplay elements with some great design philosophy behind them that, like you said, we've sort of just lost due to the whole nature of uh you just picking a funnel and deciding how, like, what funnel to go through instead of forgoing the funnel altogether and just meandering about to do whatever you would like. And in the Ultima case, my friend's favorite way to play Ultima, as weird as it is, was to find cats and beat up cats to raise the unarmed combat for reasons I never understood. But you know, that's not really something that exists in a lot of games. It's the ability to do whatever you want to just achieve whatever goals you feel are important, if that makes any sense.
Of course, because it's much more important to optimize, to puppet your users as much as possible to optimize revenue return. The points of these large multi-users environments more and more are not for your entertainment, they're for the maximal return for a set of shareholders extracted from your time. So
Yes, and exactly. The whole approach where um, the whole I don't know how to phrase it appropriately or properly, so I'm just gonna wing it. But the whole approach for a lot of games where it's just a capitalistic entity trying to benefit from it and create the most easily um, absorbed enjoy the most easily absorbed well, let's go with that. Screw it. Experience where, while not inherently wrong on the point of the game, because I don't want to speak ill of games that have streamlined things to make it easier to enjoy, because that's well, it might be due to X, it's not causation and correlation. Sorry, that's where I'm going with that. But I understand completely, and the capitalistic mindset to just try and push that is kind of is a blight on gaming and on a lot of things, and having focus on doing things and enjoying things without it having to constantly push for a uh, monetistic return or what have you, um, is great. I apologize. I'm dangerously into the realm of things that I am not capable of talking about, as I'm kind of certain it's shown from my bumbling around there. But I understand what you're saying, and yes, I agree. And it's nice to know that sometimes there are games and things that aren't 100% driven by just what's going to be the most revenue increasing, if that makes sense. Everything that I just said.
Yep, absolutely.
So, Anton, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. However, I did want to ask this one, and depending on where we go with this, I might have a follow-up if you still have the time for me. But what kind of game would you like to create if you were given the freedom? And, you know, does that have anything to do with your favorite genre that I'm assuming your favorite genre that we kind of just discussed?
Well, it's funny because I would say that the things that I love to play are not necessarily the things that I always love to make. And those have sort of shifted a bunch over time. Like I love making really sandbox oriented gameplay. I don't really like playing it as much because the time that I would expend playing it, I would rather just be making it. You know what I mean? But in terms of what I think, like in many ways I have all the freedom that I could ever. I'm actually indie. We don't have a publisher sort of thing. Like we march to our own tune. Um but I feel that the thing that constrains me, of course, is that sort of relationship of market fit and likelihood of revenue return relative to the amount of effort that something would take. Like I would love to make a I would love to make a very very deep immersive sim, which of course if there is if there's a bottomless fit pit lined with molasses as a game in game genre form, it is the immersive sim in terms of the amount of work that that can end up taking, because you're talking about defining a significantly deeper sort of standard of verbs and interaction ontology to begin with, and then having those things cross interact and having to define all of those things. It can very quickly explode super linearly in terms of effort to make even very simple things work consistently and make sense. And the other, frankly put, is just a genre that I feel is really on its way out, is really a dying genre, which is the single player, roughly linear, story driven first person shooter. Like, part of me would love to just make a Half-Life like sort of thing, but the reality is that the amount of resources and like it's about the total development time and resources per average user minute of playing a game is a terrible return. Like it takes a long time to make 30 good minutes of a linear story driven first person shooter, and the average user is going to play those 30 minutes once, and then they're going to be like, so where's more content, sort of thing. And because of the fact that the market that we're in, the like we're in a um we're in a market right now where where a lot of the driving trends of the gaming community are like a game that is no longer still getting content is a dead game immediately, and that people want forever games in larger and larger amounts. It's never been more challenging, I think, to release a one and done linear narrative game, especially as an indie, because especially because you're coming at things from a non-traditional standpoint, from a marketing, word of mouth. If if you have a game that people are engaging with a little bit every week, they slowly spread that through their network of friends, sort of thing. If you have a game that you play once, sort of thing, someone goes it, they play it once, they uninstall it, it never shows up in their friends list. People don't see them playing it, etc. You don't get the viral network effects that get, forever games, that like a builder game like Satisfactory gets, or Valheim, or a multiplayer game, etc. So I think it's, with the nature of the market and the platforms and just the way that people consume media now, the sort of game that I think I would really adore making has it's a bad bet. With our notoriety with H3, we could still probably make that a moderate success, I would think, but it would be a very scary prospect to make. And so those are the ways, you know. But if someone just was like, here's $umpteen million, make what's in your heart, sort of thing, it would probably be a Half-Life like, or a Half-Life 2 like, in structure.
And I've never actually thought about the amount of work that has to go into something like that, because you're absolutely correct when it comes to a game like Half-Life, where it was I don't even think it's arguable. But with Half-Life, where it was the game that said a first-person shooter can be narratively driven. Um, the amount of work to craft each and every interaction, that 30-minute hallway or what have you, would would absolutely be a mind-blowing amount of work. And it's like it's one of those things where when you play maybe some older first-person shooters, like Doom or like Duke Nukem 3D or Shadow Warrior, what have you, those, well, linear, those aren't really story driven. So and I don't mean this any kind of insult to anyone that makes these kind of games now or have in the past or will in the future, but it's, a very different beast to have a level by level, arena shooter, so to say, versus a strongly story driven, with story beats and plot points that are a little deeper than um, hell has invaded Mars, or aliens have invaded Earth, or what have you, right? Where and saying that now makes me realize, that kind of is all Half-Life is, in a really rudimentary sense. But it's more the minute to minute or chapter to chapter gameplay, so to say, that I never really considered just how much work would need to go in to define that chapter to chapter gameplay, even outside of, the arena to arena or what have you. And that's, absolutely, uh, I understand absolutely where you're coming from with that. And, uh, now the realization that just um, how much of a undertaking financially and non-financially, even, that kind of project would be.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the best way to close that question out, is with an
Yep.
exasperated yeah. So
Yep.
thank you for that. Now, Anton, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. However, if you have a few more minutes, I'd love to maybe ask you a question that might not be gaming related.
Sure.
Awesome. So thank you. And I apologize because this question is a little rough. It's kind of new and I'm still kind of working it out. But outside of games, what other hobbies do you enjoy? Like, what do you do that what do you do now to relax that might not be gaming related?
I love to cook. You know, cooking for me is everything that the day-to-day work on a game and the specific types of disciplines that I have to engage with isn't. It's 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 for me, especially the way that I cook, the way I approach being in the kitchen is a discipline of like pure improvisation. I don't really use recipes. Like I'll look up a recipe in terms of like, well, someone fried X ingredient, what temperature did they use, etc. But I don't hold the recipe with me. It's always I'm trying to adapt an approach and play and avoid rule-based systems as much as possible. Because so much of the work that I have to do is so meticulous and so do this 17-step process exactly like this or it will explode in your face, and then now do that 100 more times. It's one of the reasons why when I cook I almost never cook the same thing ever again. I'm always tweaking and iterating and sort of trying to find some place new, and I'm very novelty driven with food. And so it's my psycho emotional refuge and the way that I recharge relative to the very specific ways that I have to use my brain for my work.
And that's great to hear. And being able to the way you describe that, the verses of it and how one kind of allows for more less rigidness, more of a dynamic, just doing things to see what happens. Um, I don't know if I misunderstood. However, if I am correct in your understand or what you said, and I'm correcting my understanding, then that's I get it completely. And outside of the bare minimum basics, so to say, like what temperature you should maybe cook meat at, to make sure it's or cook meat to or what have you. But outside of everything else, kind of does allow you to just sort of not be as constrained just to see what may or may not work. And I apologize if I misunderstood
Oh yeah,
completely
no.
the point you were making.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing is, it's one of the reasons why even as a sort of subgenre of cooking, the part that I like to focus the most on is on making and building sauces, because those are the least about, oh, here's a set of rules of how this is supposed to work sort of thing that you refer to, and it's significantly more something that you can iteratively layer and play with directly from a consistency standpoint, from a balance of flavor, from an adhesion, viscosity, all of those things. It's something that you can learn and through doing without having to like stop and and to sort of like, well, we're just gonna keep moving forward with it. Like, oh, now it's too sour and it's too thin. What are we gonna do? How are we gonna rescue it? That process for me is the sort of the exhilaration of that. That's what keeps me cooking.
And I think everyone can relate to that, whether or not they enjoy cooking as much as you. But I think everyone can definitely relate to that. More specifically to the panic of realizing you have made something too thin or too thick or too sour, and now you're just throwing caution to the wind, so to say, just to see whatever you can do to save it. And you know, I think I appreciate that mindset, and I think many others hopefully do as well, if that makes sense.
Yep, and it's also it's one of the other reasons that it is this sort of refuge for me, and why it's so comforting is the like as someone who is about to now be 6 whole years into a single game. The best part about cooking is whether it goes great or not. 30 minutes to a couple hours later, it's done forever. There's no record of it. There's no like I can be like, oh, that was yummy or not. No one has to know. It's just done and over with, and it's on to the next thing. And it's one of the yeah a necessary thing to have in one's life.
Yes, I agree completely. As you were describing everything and the way you capped it off there, um, I'll share this, whether or not it's as amusing to me as it might be to others. But I recently started making simple syrup, different simple syrups for to go into iced coffee and what have you. That's not the important part. But the last time I did it, I had a little simple syrup left, and I don't know if you know this, and I'm going to butcher it, and it is what it is when I butcher this. But the fundamental base of caramel is a simple syrup. It's a water and sugar dissolved down. And I had looked up a recipe for a simple syrup in the past, and or not a simple syrup, sorry, for a caramel, and it's effectively just like cream, butter, and then water and sugar and all that fun stuff. So I just decided to try and wing it with the material, the product or what have you that I had available to me in my apartment at that very moment. And what I can happily say is it took about 30 minutes, and at the end of those 30 minutes, it was down the drain and gone from my life forever. So,
Well, that is why I don't do baking and I don't do confections, because baking, like baking is a science, cooking is an art. And I know that's a dichotomy that isn't really true, but I know just enough about baking and working on anything that is primarily sugar based like that to know that it requires way too much rigid process than I am looking to have in my life in the kitchen.
yes, 100%. And, as I said, I I too understand that, and I too also respect the split differences on how one is particularly precise and the other isn't. But sometimes you just throw caution to the wind and see what happens. And like you said, at the end of it, even if it's just 30 minutes, it's gone forever, and it's no longer a thing that you have to worry about.
Indeed.
So, Anton, as I said, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. However, if there was something else you want to discuss, maybe a cool game, what you're doing, or something you feel more people should just be more aware of, by all means, the floor is yours. As well as please let everyone know where they can find more information about you, which I'll also be including in the episode description.
Oh yeah, I mean, I guess I think that's the I think we covered everything, all the main points really quite well. You can follow me on Twitter at your own risk. I'm just at Anton Hand, and you can of course find more about the game at h3vr.com. That should have all of the necessary links about it.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you, Anton, for making the time to for making the time to have this conversation with me. Greatly appreciated. And if
My
and
pleasure.
yeah, and if there wasn't anything else, I will definitely let you get back to your day.
Sounds great.
Awesome. So thanks again, Anton, for making the time to have this conversation with me, and thank you for joining us on the Red Tunic podcast, as well as a special thanks to Ronald Jenkins for the use of music from the title track from Road Steep. And if you like this podcast and want to support it and help it grow, please subscribe or follow me on Twitter at Red Tunic Podcast to receive the latest episodes and news, and be sure to share it with those you think also might enjoy it. Thanks, and until next time.